The morning briefing had just ended when Corporal Thorne limped through the double doors of Camp Pendleton's administrative building, her left leg dragging slightly behind her right. The shrapnel scars across her neck caught the fluorescent lighting as she moved toward the personnel office, each step deliberate despite the obvious pain. 3 junior enlisted men clustered near the coffee station immediately noticed her approach. "Look at that," whispered Private Kendricks to his companions, nodding toward Thorne's uneven gait. "Bet she's here for a medical discharge." The other 2 snickered quietly, their conversation barely concealed as she passed within earshot. "Another weekend warrior who couldn't hack it," muttered Private Hassan, stirring his coffee with exaggerated casualness. Thorne's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she continued forward without acknowledging their comments. The manila folder in her hand contained transfer orders she'd been waiting 6 months to receive, ever since the doctors cleared her for limited duty. The burns on her forearms, still pink and tender beneath her sleeves, served as constant reminders of the explosion that had changed everything 3 years ago. Sergeant Morrison emerged from the personnel office, clipboard in hand, and spotted Thorne approaching. His expression immediately shifted to one of bureaucratic efficiency tinged with poorly concealed impatience. "Let me guess," he said loud enough for the nearby soldiers to hear, "another medical evaluation request. You know we process those on Tuesdays and Thursdays only." The 3 privates by the coffee station exchanged knowing glances. Kendricks shook his head slowly, already anticipating another sob story about combat injuries and special accommodations. Hassan checked his watch dramatically, as if Thorne's presence was disrupting his entire morning schedule. Before we continue with this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed similar acts of courage in military communities where you're from. "Actually, Sergeant," Thorne replied evenly, "I'm here to process my transfer orders." She extended the folder toward Morrison, who accepted it with visible reluctance. His eyes scanned the first page quickly, expecting to see the familiar medical discharge paperwork he'd processed dozens of times before. "Transfer orders," Hassan repeated to his companions with barely contained amusement. "Wonder where they're shipping damaged goods these days." Kendricks nodded in agreement, taking another sip of his coffee while watching the interaction unfold. Morrison's eyebrows furrowed as he read deeper into the documentation. The transfer destination wasn't a medical facility or administrative posting, as he'd assumed. His finger traced down the page, stopping at a section that made him blink twice before reading it again. The coffee station conversation continued behind him, the 3 privates now openly discussing Thorne's visible injuries and speculating about her combat experience. "Must have been a supply clerk who got too close to something that went boom," Kendricks observed with casual cruelty. Hassan laughed quietly, nodding toward Thorne's scarred neck. "Probably never even saw real action, just in the wrong place at the wrong time." The administrative building's air conditioning hummed steadily overhead, but tension had begun to build in the space between Thorne's dignified silence and the increasingly bold commentary from the watching soldiers. Morrison continued reading, his expression gradually shifting from bureaucratic annoyance to something approaching confusion, then concern. Thorne stood perfectly still, her posture military straight despite the obvious discomfort in her injured leg. The folder Morrison held contained more than simple transfer orders. Hidden within the standard paperwork were commendations, operational summaries, and classification levels that painted a very different picture than her current appearance suggested. "Hey, Sarge," called Private Hassan from across the room. "How long is this going to take? Some of us have actual work to do today." His companions chuckled appreciatively, their confidence growing with each passing moment that their commentary went unchallenged. Morrison's finger had stopped moving across the page. His lips were pressed together in a thin line as he absorbed information that contradicted every assumption he'd made about the woman standing before him. The transfer orders weren't routine administrative paperwork. They were something else entirely, something that required immediate attention and absolute discretion. The 3 privates continued their whispered conversation, each comment more dismissive than the last. They had no idea that their casual cruelty was being observed by someone whose service record would silence their laughter permanently if they only knew the truth. Morrison's hand trembled slightly as he turned to the second page of Thorne's file. The classification stamps at the top caught his attention first, followed by a series of operational codes he'd never seen before on routine personnel paperwork. Behind him, the three privates had grown bolder in their commentary, their voices carrying across the administrative office with increasing confidence. $20 says she's headed to some desk job at the Pentagon, Kendricks announced to his companions, gesturing toward Thorne with his coffee cup. You know how they love to parade around their wounded warriors for the photo ops. Hassan snorted derisively, shaking his head as he watched Thorne's careful, measured stance. Probably can't even pass a basic fitness test anymore, Hassan added with a cruel smile. Look at how she's favoring that leg. But she hasn't seen a combat zone in years, just collecting disability checks and playing victim. Thorne's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the strap of her duty bag, but her expression remained neutral. The burns on her neck seemed more prominent under the harsh office lighting, the scarred tissue telling a story that none of the watching soldiers bothered to consider. She'd learned long ago that responding to ignorant comments only encouraged more of them. Morrison continued reading, his confusion deepening with each line of text. The operational summaries reference locations he recognized from classified briefings, missions that had never been publicly acknowledged. His throat felt dry as he encountered names of units that officially didn't exist, embedded within documentation that should never have crossed his desk. Sergeant Hassan called out again, his patience wearing thin. How much longer is this medical evaluation going to take? We've got actual Marines to process today, not charity cases looking for extended benefits. The comment drew appreciative chuckles from Kendricks and the third private, Rodriguez, who had remained mostly quiet but was clearly enjoying the show. Rodriguez finally spoke up, his voice carrying across the room with deliberate volume. My cousin got hurt in Afghanistan, and he didn't spend 3 years milking the system for sympathy points. Morrison's eyes had found a section of the file that made his blood pressure spike. Combat decorations were listed in neat rows, each one representing actions that contradicted everything the three privates assumed about the woman standing before him. Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart with 2 clusters. The list continued down the page, each award representing a level of heroism that few Marines ever achieved. Look at her just standing there, Kendricks observed with mock sympathy, probably expecting special treatment because she got a little banged up overseas. The other two nodded in agreement, their commentary becoming more pointed as Thorne continued to maintain her dignified silence. Hassan leaned back against the coffee station, crossing his arms with theatrical impatience. I've seen plenty of real heroes come through here, and they don't need to limp around looking for pity. Real Marines adapt and overcome. They don't spend years feeling sorry for themselves. The administrative office felt smaller somehow, the walls seeming to close in as Morrison discovered details that transformed his understanding of the woman before him. Operational summaries described actions under fire that would terrify experienced combat veterans. Mission after mission, each one more dangerous than the last, painting a picture of service that went far beyond normal Marine Corps duty. Rodriguez decided to join the verbal assault more actively. But she's got some sob story about how she saved her whole unit or something, he said with exaggerated drama. They all do, right? Always the hero in their own story, never mind the real Marines who actually got the job done. Thorne shifted her weight slightly, the movement betraying the constant pain she carried from injuries that ran much deeper than the visible scars. The shrapnel in her leg was the least of her problems, but it was the only one these soldiers could see, and therefore the only one they felt qualified to judge. Morrison had reached a section of the file that made him question everything he thought he knew about military protocol. Unit assignments that didn't appear in any official database, deployment records to locations that weren't supposed to exist, and commendations signed by officers whose names carried weight at the highest levels of command. Maybe we should start a collection, Kendricks suggested with fake charity. Help her get back on her feet, literally. His companions found this particularly amusing, their laughter echoing off the office walls while Thorne continued to wait with professional patience. Hassan pushed away from the coffee station, approaching closer to get a better look at the supposed invalid who was taking up so much of their morning. Wonder what kind of soft assignment they're giving her now, he mused aloud. Probably something in public relations where she can tell her war stories to reporters. The three privates had no idea that their casual cruelty was about to be interrupted by forces they couldn't comprehend. Morrison's hands were shaking now as he realized the magnitude of what he was reading, and somewhere in the building, other eyes were beginning to take notice of the disrespectful display unfolding in the administrative office. Through the administrative building's main entrance, three figures in desert camouflage moved with the purposeful stride that marked them as special operations personnel. Chief Petty Officer Nakamura led the group, followed closely by Petty Officer First Class Brennan and Petty Officer Second Class Volkov. They'd come to process their own routine paperwork, but the scene unfolding near the personnel office immediately caught their attention. Nakamura's trained eye took in the situation quickly. A wounded Marine standing at attention despite obvious injuries, while three junior enlisted men made increasingly bold comments about her condition. The casual cruelty in their voices carried clearly across the office space, each word dripping with the kind of ignorant arrogance that set his teeth on edge. "Check out the war hero over there," Hassan was saying to his companions, his voice deliberately loud enough to ensure Thorne could hear every word. "But she's got some Purple Heart for getting too close to a car bomb while delivering mail or something." Brennan's jaw clenched as he recognized the pattern. He'd seen this type of disrespect before, usually from soldiers who'd never faced real combat themselves. The three SEALs had stopped their forward movement, positioning themselves where they could observe without being obvious about it. Kendricks raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "Here's to all the heroes who couldn't handle a real deployment," he announced with theatrical grandeur. "May they find comfortable desk jobs where they can't hurt themselves or anyone else." Volkov's hands slowly formed fists at his sides. The scars visible on the Marine's neck told a story he recognized, the kind of injuries that came from close encounters with explosive devices in hostile territory. These weren't the marks of someone who'd been safely behind the lines. Morrison continued reading through Thorne's file, his expression growing more troubled with each page. The operational details were becoming clearer now, painting a picture that contradicted everything the three privates assumed. His finger traced across mission summaries that described actions under fire, repeated deployments to the most dangerous areas of operation. Rodriguez decided to escalate his participation in the harassment. "My drill instructor always said real Marines don't whine about their injuries," he declared loudly. "They either heal up and get back to work, or they get out of the way for people who can still do the job." The comment struck Nakamura like a physical blow. He'd served with Marines who'd made ultimate sacrifices for their country, and watching these three mock someone whose service record they couldn't begin to comprehend filled him with barely controlled rage. Brennan caught his chief's eye and received a subtle nod of understanding. Hassan approached even closer to Thorne's position, emboldened by his companion's encouragement. "Wonder what kind of stories she tells to get all this special treatment," he mused with fake curiosity. Probably something about heroically getting wounded while everyone else did the real fighting. Thorne's breathing remained steady despite the escalating verbal assault. The pain in her leg was nothing compared to the frustration of listening to ignorant speculation about sacrifices these soldiers couldn't imagine. The folder Morrison held contained the truth, but protocol required her to remain silent until officially processed. Volkov whispered quietly to his teammates. "Those aren't ordinary combat injuries. The scarring pattern, the way she carries herself, someone who's seen serious action." Brennan nodded grimly, his own experience allowing him to read the signs that the three privates completely missed. Morrison had reached a section of the file that made him set it down on his desk with shaking hands. Unit designations that he'd only heard whispered about in classified briefings, operations that had never been officially acknowledged, commendations from officers whose names appeared in legend more than official records. Kendricks was warming to his theme now, clearly enjoying the audience. Bet she's one of those Marines who gets wounded in some accident and then spends years telling everyone how she's a combat veteran. Real warriors don't need to advertise their service with visible scars. The three SEALs exchanged glances loaded with meaning. They'd remained silent long enough, gathering information and assessing the situation. Nakamura's decision was made, but he wanted to time their intervention perfectly for maximum impact. Rodriguez leaned against the nearby wall, his confidence growing with each unanswered insult. Probably headed to some public relations assignment where she can play the wounded warrior for visiting politicians, he suggested with obvious disdain. That's what they do with Marines who can't handle real duty anymore. Hassan laughed appreciatively at his companion's creativity. Yeah, perfect job for someone who looks the part but can't actually perform. Politicians love that kind of theater, makes them feel good about supporting the troops without having to deal with real soldiers. The administrative office had become a stage for casual cruelty, with Thorne as the unwilling target of ignorant assumptions. Morrison continued reading, his understanding of the situation transforming completely as more classified details emerged from her service record. The three SEALs prepared to take action, their patience finally exhausted by the escalating disrespect they'd witnessed. Hassan's confidence had reached dangerous levels as he moved closer to Thorne, his voice carrying the cruel satisfaction of someone who believed himself completely safe from consequences. Maybe we should help her practice walking without that limp, he suggested to his companions with mock helpfulness. Tough love to get her back in fighting shape. The suggestion drew immediate laughter from Kendricks and Rodriguez, who were clearly enjoying their perceived power over someone they viewed as helpless. Kendricks set down his coffee cup and approached, joining Hassan in creating a loose semicircle around Thorne's position near the personnel desk. Great idea, Kendricks agreed enthusiastically. Nothing like a little motivation to overcome those psychological injuries. Most of that limping is probably just for show anyway, right? Real Marines don't let a little shrapnel slow them down. Rodriguez pushed himself away from the wall, completing the formation that now had Thorne partially surrounded. His earlier hesitation had completely disappeared, replaced by the mob mentality that made cowards feel brave. Come on, Marine, he taunted, straightening his posture in an exaggerated military bearing. Show us some of that famous Marine Corps discipline. Morrison's hands were trembling as he reached the final pages of Thorne's classified file. The operational summaries read like something from an action movie, except every detail was documented with the bureaucratic precision that marked genuine military records. Multiple tours in classified locations, leadership of high-risk missions, personal actions that had saved countless lives. Nakamura's patience had reached its absolute limit. The three SEALs had witnessed enough casual cruelty to justify intervention, but the physical positioning of the harassers around their target crossed a line that demanded immediate response. He caught Brennan's eye and nodded toward the personnel desk area. Hassan was now standing directly in front of Thorne, his posture deliberately intimidating as he studied her scarred features with theatrical concern. Those burns look pretty bad, he observed with fake sympathy. Must have been really scary when whatever happened. Hope he didn't embarrass the Corps by crying or anything. The comment struck deeper than any physical blow could have. Thorne's jaw muscle twitched slightly, the first visible crack in her professional composure since entering the building. The three privates noticed immediately, their predatory instincts recognizing vulnerability and moving to exploit it. Rodriguez decided to press the advantage he thought they'd gained. Yeah, we've all heard stories about Marines who fall apart under pressure, he said with deliberate cruelty. Always wondered what that looks like in real life. Must be pretty pathetic to watch. Brennan and Volkov had begun moving, their approach masked by the casual movement of personnel through the administrative building. Years of special operations training had taught them how to position themselves without alerting targets to their presence. Kendricks was feeling particularly bold now, emboldened by Thorne's slight reaction to Hassan's previous comment. Bet you still have nightmares about whatever happened over there, he suggested with mock concern. That's what happens to Marines who aren't tough enough for real combat, right? They break down and spend years feeling sorry for themselves. Morrison had found a section of the file that made him stand up abruptly from his desk chair. The action was so sudden that it caught the attention of several nearby personnel, including the three privates who glanced over with annoyed expressions at the interruption of their entertainment. "What's the hold-up, Sergeant?" Hassan called out impatiently. "We don't have all day to wait while you process another medical discharge. Some of us have actual Marine Corps business to attend to." The casual dismissal of Morrison's obvious distress only demonstrated how completely the three privates misunderstood the situation they'd created. Hassan turned back to Thorne with renewed confidence, his proximity now uncomfortably close for someone in obvious physical distress. "Tell you what, Marine," Hassan said with fake generosity. "Why don't you demonstrate some of that famous Marine Corps pride for us? Maybe show us how well you can stand at attention with those injuries. Consider it occupational therapy." Rodriguez laughed appreciatively at the suggestion. "Yeah, let's see if you can hold proper military bearing for more than 30 seconds without whimpering about your war wounds." Real Marines don't let a little pain interfere with their duty. The three SEALs were now within striking distance, their positioning calculated to maximize effectiveness when they chose to reveal themselves. Nakamura's training had taught him to gather complete intelligence before acting, and what he'd observed over the past several minutes had provided more than enough justification for what was about to happen. Kendricks reached toward Thorne's shoulder as if to adjust her posture, his action crossing from verbal harassment into physical intimidation. The movement was casual but deliberately invasive, designed to demonstrate the power dynamic he believed existed between them. Morrison had reached for his desk phone, his hands shaking as he realized the magnitude of the mistake being committed right in front of him. The classified information in Thorne's file painted a picture of service that would terrify the three privates if they had any understanding of what they were really confronting. The moment Kendricks's hand moved toward Thorne's shoulder, three things happened simultaneously. Nakamura's voice cut through the administrative office like a blade. Brennan stepped into Hassan's peripheral vision with the fluid grace of a predator, and Volkov positioned himself directly behind Rodriguez with a silent efficiency that marked years of special operations training. "Gentlemen," Nakamura announced, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made seasoned warriors stop what they were doing and pay attention. The single word froze all three privates in their tracks, their heads turning toward the source of interruption with expressions of annoyed surprise. Hassan was the first to recover from the unexpected intervention, his confidence intact because he assumed these were just more personnel processing routine paperwork. "Yeah, what?" he replied with casual disrespect, not bothering to check the rank insignia or unit patches that would have immediately identified the men now surrounding them. Kendricks's hand was still extended toward Thorne's shoulder, frozen in mid-motion as his brain processed the sudden change in the room's dynamic. The three newcomers moved with a precision that suggested extensive combat training, but the privates were too focused on their own entertainment to recognize the warning signs. Rodriguez turned completely around to face Volkov, his expression showing irritation at having their fun interrupted by what he assumed were more administrative personnel. "We're kind of busy here," he said with exaggerated patience. "Maybe you guys can wait your turn like everyone else." Brennan's smile was cold as winter steel as he studied Hassan's posture and expression. The SEAL had encountered this type of bully countless times during his military career, soldiers who picked on those they perceived as weak while cowering before anyone who might actually fight back. Morrison had managed to reach his phone and was frantically dialing a number that appeared near the top of Thorne's classified file. His hands shook as he waited for someone to answer, knowing that the situation in his office was about to explode into something far beyond his ability to control. "Sorry to interrupt your conversation," Nakamura continued with deceptive politeness, his tone carrying undertones that made smart people nervous. "But we couldn't help overhearing some interesting comments about Marine Corps service and combat injuries. Thought maybe we could contribute to the discussion." Hassan looked the three SEALs up and down with dismissive assessment, completely missing the significance of their unit patches and the subtle indicators that marked them as special operations personnel. "Listen, we don't need any lectures about respecting wounded warriors or whatever," he said with confident arrogance. Kendricks finally lowered his hand, but remained uncomfortably close to Thorne, his body language still aggressive despite the new arrivals. "We're just having a friendly conversation with our fellow Marine here," he explained with fake innocence. "Nothing that concerns Navy personnel, right?" The comment about Navy personnel drew genuine amusement from all three SEALs, though their smiles carried no warmth whatsoever. Volkov stepped closer to Rodriguez, his movement casual but purposeful as he invaded the private's personal space in the same way they'd been crowding Thorne. "You're absolutely right," Volkov agreed with deceptive pleasantness. "Navy personnel shouldn't interfere with Marine Corps business. But we're not here on Navy business today. We're here because we couldn't help but notice three Marines demonstrating some interesting ideas about military courtesy and respect for combat veterans." Morrison's phone call had finally connected, and his whispered conversation was becoming increasingly urgent as he described the situation to whoever had answered. The words "classified assignment" and "immediate intervention" carried clearly across the office space. Rodriguez felt the first stirrings of unease as he processed Volkov's proximity and tone. The SEAL was standing close enough that Rodriguez could see the combat decorations on his uniform, ribbons that suggested extensive deployment experience in hostile environments. Hassan remained oblivious to the changing dynamics, his arrogance intact despite the obvious tension building around him. "Look, whatever your problem is, we're just talking to a fellow service member," he insisted with defensive aggression. "Last time I checked, conversation wasn't against military regulations." Brennan moved another step closer to Hassan, his movement fluid and controlled in a way that suggested extensive hand-to-hand combat training. "That's interesting," he observed with clinical detachment, because from where we were standing, it looked more like three Marines harassing a wounded veteran who was trying to conduct official business. Kendricks finally began to recognize that something was seriously wrong with their situation. The three newcomers moved and spoke with the confidence of men who were accustomed to dangerous situations, and their interest in the confrontation suggested consequences the privates hadn't anticipated. "Actually," Nakamura added conversationally, "we were particularly interested in the comments about real Marines and combat experience. Thought maybe we could share some perspectives on what those terms actually mean. From people who might have some relevant background in the subject matter." The administrative office had become a powder keg waiting for ignition, with three bullies suddenly finding themselves surrounded by men whose capabilities they couldn't begin to comprehend. Hassan's arrogance reached its absolute peak as he dismissed the SEAL's presence with a wave of his hand. "Listen, Navy boys," he announced with deliberate condescension, "we don't need career sailors telling us how to handle Marine Corps personnel. Why don't you go swab a deck or something and let the Real military handle this?" The insult hung in the air like a live grenade with the pin pulled. Brennan's smile disappeared completely, replaced by an expression that had preceded violence in a dozen different combat zones. Volkov's hands moved to a relaxed position that special operations veterans would recognize as a combat stance. Rodriguez, emboldened by Hassan's boldness, decided to escalate even further. "Yeah, this is between Marines," he declared with false bravado. "We don't need some Navy SEAL wannabes interfering with our business. Go find your own wounded sailor to feel sorry for." The moment Rodriguez said SEAL wannabes, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Nakamura's eyes narrowed as he processed the casual dismissal of credentials that had been earned through years of the most demanding training the military offered. Kendricks pushed his luck even further, apparently emboldened by his companion's boldness. "Besides," he added with cruel satisfaction, "we're just trying to motivate our fellow Marine here to stop feeling sorry for herself. Real warriors don't need protection from a bunch of Navy personnel with hero complexes." Morrison's phone conversation had become increasingly frantic as he tried to explain the developing crisis to someone who clearly outranked everyone in the building. His repeated use of phrases like immediate intervention and classified personnel suggested that help was coming, but probably not soon enough to prevent disaster. Hassan turned back toward Thorne with renewed confidence, apparently convinced that the three SEALs were just another group of personnel who would back down when confronted with Marine Corps authority. "Come on, hero," he taunted, stepping even closer to her position. "Show these Navy boys how a real Marine handles a little constructive criticism." Thorne's composure finally cracked slightly, not from Hassan's proximity, but from watching three men whose service she recognized being insulted by soldiers who had no idea what they were confronting. Her slight shift in posture was barely noticeable, but the SEALs caught it immediately. Rodriguez decided to make the situation personal, pointing directly at Thorne while addressing the SEALs. "This Marine right here is probably going to spend the rest of her career collecting disability checks and telling war stories to anyone who'll listen. That's not the kind of person who needs protection from real warriors." The comment about disability checks struck Volkov like a physical blow. He'd served with Marines who'd made ultimate sacrifices, and watching these three mock someone whose service record they couldn't comprehend filled him with barely controlled rage. Hassan was now standing close enough to Thorne that his breath moved strands of her hair as he spoke. "Maybe you can tell your Navy friends here about how you got those scars," he suggested with mock intimacy. "I'm sure they'd love to hear another sob story about getting hurt in a combat zone." Kendricks laughed appreciatively at Hassan's performance, completely oblivious to the fact that three of the military's most elite warriors were measuring them for destruction. "Come on, give us the whole story," he encouraged. "How exactly does a Marine end up looking like she lost a fight with an IED?" Morrison had hung up his phone and was now frantically gathering papers from his desk, clearly preparing to evacuate the immediate area. His movements were quick and nervous, like someone who'd just been told that a bomb was about to explode in his office. The administrative building's normal sounds of typing and conversation had gradually stopped as other personnel sensed the building tension near the personnel desk. Several civilian employees had quietly moved away from the area, their survival instincts warning them that something dangerous was developing. Rodriguez made the final mistake that would trigger immediate consequences. He reached out and actually touched Thorne's arm, his grip firm enough to cause obvious discomfort to someone dealing with combat injuries. "Come on, Marine," he demanded with cruel insistence. "Tell us exactly how you got hurt so badly that you can't even walk properly anymore." The physical contact was the line that transformed harassment into assault. Nakamura's training kicked in automatically, his body moving before his conscious mind had finished processing the violation. Brennan and Volkov reacted simultaneously, their years of coordinated operations allowing them to move as a single unit. In the space of 2 heartbeats, 3 highly trained special operations warriors had shifted from observers to active participants in a confrontation that was about to teach 3 bullies the most expensive lesson of their military careers. Rodriguez's hand was still gripping Thorne's arm when Nakamura's voice cut through the administrative office with the kind of authority that made colonels stand at attention. "Remove your hand from the Marine," he commanded, his tone carrying the weight of someone accustomed to immediate obedience in life-or-death situations. The sudden shift in Nakamura's demeanor was like watching a predator drop its camouflage. Rodriguez felt the change immediately, his grip loosening instinctively as his brain processed the very real threat now radiating from the SEAL chief. Hassan and Kendricks turned toward the source of the command, their expressions shifting from arrogant confidence to confused uncertainty. "Now," Nakamura added when Rodriguez hesitated for even a moment. The single word carried implications that made smart people move quickly to comply. Rodriguez's hand snapped back as if Thorne's arm had suddenly become white-hot, his survival instincts finally overriding his arrogance. Brennan stepped forward until he was close enough to Hassan that the private could see individual threads in the SEAL's uniform fabric. That was assault on a decorated combat veteran, he observed with clinical detachment. In front of multiple witnesses, you might want to start thinking about how you plan to explain that to your commanding officer. Hassan's mouth opened and closed without producing sound as his brain struggled to process the rapidly changing dynamics. The confidence that had carried him through the past 20 minutes was evaporating like morning dew under the focused attention of men whose capabilities he was only beginning to comprehend. Volkov positioned himself directly in front of Kendricks, his proximity forcing the private to crane his neck upward to maintain eye contact. "We heard some interesting comments about real Marines and combat experience," he said conversationally. "Thought maybe you'd like to compare notes with some people who actually have both." Morrison had abandoned his desk entirely, moving toward the far wall where he could observe the developing confrontation for what he hoped was a safe distance. The classified file lay open on his desk, its contents painting a picture that would transform everything the three privates thought they knew about their target. The administrative office had become completely silent except for the sound of nervous breathing and the subtle rustle of fabric as the SEALs adjusted their positions. Other personnel had either evacuated the immediate area or frozen in place, recognizing that they were witnessing something that could have career-ending consequences for everyone involved. Hassan finally found his voice, though it came out higher-pitched than usual. "Look, we didn't know," he began weakly, his earlier arrogance completely absent. We thought she was just another medical discharge case." "Just another medical discharge case," Nakamura repeated slowly, as if testing the words for hidden meaning. "That's interesting, because from where we were standing, it looked like 3 Marines harassing a wounded veteran who was conducting official business." Rodriguez was backing away slowly, his survival instincts finally functioning properly as he recognized the magnitude of the mistake they'd made. The SEALs moved with him, maintaining their positions like wolves circling wounded prey, their coordination so perfect it suggested countless hours of training together. Kendricks tried to salvage the situation with desperate explanation. "We didn't mean any disrespect," he said quickly, his voice carrying the panic of someone who'd just realized they were standing in a minefield. "We just thought, she doesn't look like we assumed she was." "She doesn't look like what?" Brennan interrupted with dangerous quiet. "Like a real Marine. Like someone who's seen combat. Like someone who's earned the right to wear that uniform." "Please, continue with your assessment." The 3 privates were now completely surrounded, with each SEAL maintaining close proximity to his assigned target. Years of special operations training had taught them how to control space and dominate opponents through positioning alone, and they were applying those skills with surgical precision. Volkov leaned closer to Kendricks until their faces were only inches apart. "You mentioned something about real warriors not needing protection," he said conversationally. Interesting perspective from someone whose biggest challenge today was choosing between regular and decaf coffee. Hassan made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "Look, this is getting blown way out of proportion," he pleaded, his voice betraying the fear that was beginning to overwhelm his thinking. "We're all on the same side here. We're all American military personnel." Nakamura's smile was winter cold as he processed Hassan's appeal for solidarity. "Same side," he repeated thoughtfully. "That's fascinating, because 30 seconds ago you were explaining how Navy personnel should mind their own business while Marines handle Marine Corps affairs." The administrative building's air conditioning system seemed unusually loud in the sudden silence that followed. 3 bullies had finally encountered consequences for their actions, and the men delivering those consequences possessed both the authority and capability to make those lessons permanent and unforgettable. Nakamura's expression shifted from cold anger to something approaching professional curiosity as he studied the 3 privates who were now pressed against various pieces of office furniture in their attempts to create distance. "You gentlemen seem to have some strong opinions about combat veterans and military service," he observed thoughtfully. "Maybe it's time we discuss qualifications for making those kinds of assessments." Hassan's back was against the coffee station counter. His earlier confidence completely evaporated as he found himself pinned by Brennan's unwavering stare. "We didn't mean anything by it," he repeated desperately, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were just talking, just conversation between service members." "Just conversation," Brennan repeated with clinical interest. "That's what you call physically grabbing a wounded Marine and demanding details about her combat injuries." Fascinating interpretation of casual discussion. Rodriguez had managed to wedge himself between two filing cabinets, his face pale as he processed the implications of what Volkov had said about assault charges. The SEAL's proximity made thinking difficult. But even through his panic, he was beginning to understand that their victim wasn't the helpless target they'd assumed. Kendricks made one final attempt to deflect responsibility, his voice cracking under stress. "Look, maybe we got a little carried away, but she never said anything about being some kind of war hero or anything. How are we supposed to know she was important? How are you supposed to know?" Volkov repeated slowly, as if explaining something to a particularly slow child. "Perhaps by treating every service member with the basic respect their uniform represents. Or maybe by not assuming that visible injuries indicate weakness rather than sacrifice." Morrison had been watching the confrontation unfold while clutching Thorne's classified file to his chest. The weight of what he'd read was becoming unbearable as he witnessed 3 Marines systematically destroying their careers through ignorant cruelty towards someone whose service record would silence their laughter permanently. Nakamura turned slightly toward Morrison's position, his movement casual but purposeful. "Sergeant Morrison," he called out formally, drawing the administrator's attention. "Perhaps you could share some details about the Marine these gentlemen have been so eager to educate about military service and combat experience." Morrison's hands trembled as he opened the classified file, knowing that what he was about to reveal would transform the 3 privates' arrogance into the kind of horror that haunted people for the rest of their lives. The documentation he held painted a picture of service that went far beyond anything these soldiers could comprehend. Actually, Hassan interrupted desperately, trying to prevent whatever revelation was coming. "We don't need to make this into some big official thing. We can all just forget this happened and move on like professionals, right?" "Forget this happened," Brennan repeated with genuine amazement. "You want us to forget watching 3 Marines assault a combat veteran while mocking her service-connected injuries? That's your proposed solution to this situation?" Rodriguez was hyperventilating now, his breathing rapid and shallow as the full scope of their mistake began to penetrate his panic. The SEAL's positioning and tone suggested consequences that went far beyond simple disciplinary action, and their obvious familiarity with military justice procedures painted a terrifying picture of his immediate future. Kendricks tried one last desperate appeal to what he assumed was shared enlisted solidarity. "Come on, we're all just trying to serve our country here," he pleaded. "Maybe we can work this out between ourselves without involving officers or making it official." Volkov's laugh was completely devoid of humor as he processed the suggestion. "Work it out between ourselves," he repeated thoughtfully, "like you were working things out when you surrounded a wounded Marine and demanded she justify her combat injuries to your satisfaction." Morrison approached slowly, the classified file open to a page that displayed more combat decorations than most Marines accumulated in entire careers. His voice shook as he began to read the official summary of Thorne's service record, each word driving another nail into the coffin of the 3 privates' military futures. "The Marine you've been harassing," Morrison began formally, his voice carrying across the silent administrative office, "is Corporal Elena Thorne, recipient of the Silver Star with Valor, Bronze Star with 2 oak leaf clusters, Purple Heart with 3 clusters, and the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat operations." The words hit the 3 privates like physical blows, each decoration representing a level of service and sacrifice that contradicted everything they'd assumed about their target. Hassan's face went white as he processed the implications of what they'd done to someone whose courage under fire was literally legendary. Rodriguez slumped against the filing cabinets as the full weight of their mistake crushed his ability to think clearly. The Navy Cross was awarded for actions that approached Medal of Honor-level heroism, and they'd spent the morning mocking someone whose service record would inspire respect from generals. Nakamura's smile was completely predatory now as he watched the three privates absorb the magnitude of their error. And that, he added conversationally, is just the unclassified portion of her service record. The details you don't have clearance to hear would terrify you into requesting immediate transfer to civilian life. Morrison continued reading from the classified file, his voice growing stronger as he delivered each devastating detail about Thorne's service record. Operation Blackwater, Syria, 2019, he announced formally. Corporal Thorne single-handedly held a defensive position for 6 hours against overwhelming enemy forces, allowing the evacuation of 17 wounded Marines and 3 Navy SEALs. Hassan's legs buckled slightly as he processed the information. 3 Navy SEALs had owed their lives to the woman they'd been mocking for the past hour. His eyes darted toward Nakamura, Brennan, and Volkov, suddenly understanding why these particular SEALs had taken such personal interest in the harassment. Operation Steel Rain, Afghanistan, 2020, Morrison continued relentlessly. Corporal Thorne led a rescue mission into enemy territory to recover the crew of a downed helicopter, sustaining multiple injuries, including severe burns and shrapnel wounds, while ensuring the safe extraction of all personnel. Rodriguez was now sitting on the floor, his back against the filing cabinets as the weight of their mistake crushed his ability to remain standing. The burns on Thorne's neck suddenly took on new meaning, transforming from sources of mockery into evidence of heroism that exceeded anything he could imagine. Brennan stepped closer to Hassan, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "Those 3 SEALs she saved in Syria," he said conversationally, "were from our unit. Petty Officer Martinez, Petty Officer Thompson, and Chief Ramirez. You've been mocking the woman who risked her life to bring our brothers home." The revelation hit Hassan like a physical blow to the stomach. The casual cruelty they displayed had been directed towards someone who'd literally saved the lives of men these SEALs considered family. His understanding of their anger shifted from confusion to absolute terror as he realized the personal nature of their involvement. Kendricks was hyperventilating now, his breathing rapid and shallow, as Morrison continued reading through operation after operation, where Thorne had distinguished herself through actions that went far beyond normal military duty. Each mission summary painted a picture of courage under fire that made their morning harassment seem like a form of sacrilege. Operation Iron Shield, Iraq, 2021, Morrison announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent administrative office. Corporal Thorne voluntarily remained behind during a base evacuation to maintain communication with incoming aircraft, sustaining life-threatening injuries when the communications bunker took a direct hit from enemy artillery. Volkov leaned down until his face was level with Rodriguez, who was still sitting on the floor in shock. Those life-threatening injuries, he explained quietly, included the leg damage you've been making fun of all morning. She refused medical evacuation until every aircraft had landed safely and all personnel were accounted for. The administrative building had become a cathedral of shame, with 3 bullies confronting the reality that they'd spent their morning torturing someone whose sacrifice had saved dozens of lives. Other personnel had begun gathering at a respectful distance, drawn by the formal reading of a service record that represented the highest ideals of military service. Morrison turned another page, revealing operational details that made even the SEALs stand slightly straighter in recognition of extraordinary service. Operation Crimson Dawn, classified location, 2022, he read formally. Corporal Thorne led a deep reconnaissance mission behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence that prevented a major terrorist attack on American forces. Hassan had begun crying, the weight of his cruelty crushing his ability to maintain composure. The woman they'd surrounded and mocked had risked her life repeatedly to protect people exactly like them, and they'd repaid her sacrifice with ignorant harassment and physical intimidation. Nakamura's voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence as he addressed the 3 privates who were now completely broken by the revelation of their victim's true identity. Every injury you mocked, every scar you dismissed, every limitation you ridiculed represents bloodshed in defense of Marines who will never know her name. Rodriguez looked up from his position on the floor, his face streaked with tears as he processed the magnitude of their mistake. The limp they'd made fun of was the result of shrapnel taken while she maintained communications that guided rescue aircraft through enemy fire. The burns they'd mocked came from refusing to abandon her post while under direct attack. Kendrick had stopped breathing normally, his chest rising and falling irregularly as panic overwhelmed his system. The casual cruelty that had seemed so entertaining 30 minutes ago now appeared as what it truly was. The torture of a genuine American hero by 3 soldiers who'd never faced a fraction of the challenges she'd overcome. Morrison closed the file with ceremonial precision, the sound echoing through the silent office like the closing of a coffin. The classified portions of Corporal Thorne's record, he concluded formally, detail operations that remain essential to national security but represent the highest levels of courage and sacrifice in military service. The 3 privates now understood that they hadn't just harassed another service member. They'd systematically tormented someone whose service record represented everything they'd falsely claimed to value about military service, and they'd done it in front of men whose lives she'd personally saved. The administrative office doors burst open with military precision as Colonel Patricia Williams entered accompanied by 2 master sergeants whose expressions suggested they'd been briefed on the situation during their rapid transit to the building. The colonel's eyes immediately swept the scene, taking in 3 traumatized privates, 3 position SEALs, and 1 wounded Marine standing at perfect attention despite obvious physical discomfort. Morrison snapped to attention so quickly he nearly dropped Thorne's classified file, his face pale as he realized that senior leadership had arrived to personally handle what had started as routine personnel processing. Colonel Williams approached his desk with the measured stride of someone accustomed to dealing with crises that could end careers. "Sergeant Morrison," the colonel announced formally, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose decisions affected thousands of Marines. "I received a priority call regarding harassment of classified personnel. Please brief me on the current situation." Hassan had managed to struggle back to his feet, but remained pressed against the coffee station counter, his face streaked with tears as he watched senior leadership take control of what had become the worst morning of his military career. The colonel's presence transformed their harassment from a disciplinary matter into something approaching a courts-martial offense. Rodriguez was still sitting on the floor, his emotional collapse complete as he processed the reality that colonels didn't personally respond to routine harassment complaints. The level of response suggested that their victim's importance went far beyond what Morrison had already revealed from her service record. Morrison opened the classified file with trembling hands, knowing that he was about to brief a full colonel on how 3 privates had systematically tormented one of the Marine Corps' most decorated combat veterans. "Ma'am," he began formally, "these 3 Marines spent approximately 1 hour harassing Corporal Elena Thorne while she waited to process transfer orders." Colonel Williams' expression darkened as she processed the name. Her familiarity with Thorne's service record was immediate and personal, suggesting a level of recognition that went beyond routine administrative knowledge. She turned toward the 3 privates with the kind of attention that made smart people consider requesting immediate transfer to civilian life. Kendricks tried to speak, his voice cracking under the pressure of having a full colonel's undivided attention focused on his morning's activities. "Ma'am, we didn't know." He began desperately, but Colonel Williams silenced him with a gesture that carried decades of command authority. "What specifically did you not know, Private Kendricks?" she asked with dangerous quiet. "Did you not know that every Marine deserves basic respect regardless of their visible injuries? Did you not know that harassment of wounded veterans violates every principle the Marine Corps represents?" Brennan stepped forward and executed a perfect salute that Colonel Williams returned with military precision. "Ma'am," he reported formally, We witnessed these three Marines physically intimidate Corporal Thorne while making derogatory comments about her combat injuries and questioning her fitness for continued service. The colonel's attention shifted to Nakamura, whose unit patch and ribbons told their own story of extensive special operations service. Chief Petty Officer Nakamura, she acknowledged formally, recognizing his rank and the significance of SEAL team involvement in what should have been routine Marine Corps business. "Ma'am," Nakamura replied with equal formality, "Corporal Thorne saved the lives of 3 members of our unit during Operation Blackwater. We take personal interest in ensuring she receives the respect her service has earned." Hassan's emotional state deteriorated further as he realized that their harassment had attracted the attention of personnel whose own service records represented the elite levels of military service. The casual cruelty that had seemed entertaining an hour ago had drawn responses from people whose careers were built on protecting exactly the kind of hero they'd been tormenting. Colonel Williams approached Thorne's position, her demeanor shifting from command authority to genuine respect as she addressed someone whose service record commanded recognition from the highest levels of military leadership. "Corporal Thorne," she said formally, on behalf of the Marine Corps, "I apologize for the treatment you've received in this facility." Thorne's response was immediate and professional despite the morning's ordeal. "No apology necessary, ma'am," she replied with the kind of dignity that had carried her through multiple combat deployments. "These Marines were simply unaware of the details of my service record." Rodriguez looked up from his position on the floor as he processed Thorne's gracious response to treatment that would have justified immediate and severe punishment for her tormentors. Her refusal to demand retribution demonstrated the kind of character that explained why she'd repeatedly risked her life for others. Colonel Williams turned back toward the 3 privates, her expression suggesting that Thorne's forgiveness would not prevent appropriate consequences for their actions. However, she continued formally, "Ignorance of a service member's background does not excuse harassment, physical intimidation, or disrespect for visible combat injuries." The administrative building had filled with personnel drawn by the unprecedented gathering of senior leadership responding to what had started as routine morning harassment. Master sergeants, staff sergeants, and other NCOs had positioned themselves where they could observe the proceedings while maintaining respectful distance from what was clearly a significant disciplinary matter. Colonel Williams positioned herself where all 3 privates could see her clearly, her command presence filling the administrative office as she prepared to deliver consequences that would reshape their understanding of military service permanently. The 2 master sergeants flanked her position, their expressions suggesting years of experience dealing with Marines who'd forgotten the fundamental principles of honor and respect. "Private Hassan," she began formally, her voice carrying the weight of official judgment. "You will report to my office at 0800 tomorrow morning to explain why you believe physical intimidation of a decorated combat veteran represents acceptable Marine Corps behavior." Hassan's remaining composure crumbled completely as he realized that a full colonel was personally taking charge of his disciplinary proceedings. The casual harassment that had seemed so entertaining 2 hours ago had triggered responses that reached the highest levels of base command. "Private Rodriguez," Colonel Williams continued without pause, "you will accompany Private Hassan to provide your perspective on why mocking service-connected injuries demonstrates the Marine Corps values you swore to uphold." Rodriguez managed to struggle back to his feet, his legs shaking as he processed the reality that his military career was effectively over. Colonels didn't personally handle routine disciplinary matters, which meant their harassment had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "Private Kendricks," the colonel concluded with ceremonial precision, "you will join your companions in explaining why 3 Marines chose to surround and intimidate someone whose sacrifice has earned recognition from the President of the United States." The mention of presidential recognition sent visible shockwaves through the assembled personnel. Thorne's service record reached levels that few Marines ever achieved, and the 3 privates had spent their mornings systematically tormenting someone whose heroism was recognized at the highest levels of government. Master Sergeant Thompson stepped forward and addressed the three privates with the kind of authority that made seasoned Marines reconsider their life choices. You will remain in this building until military police arrive to escort you to individual holding cells pending formal charges. Hassan's knees buckled as the full scope of their situation became clear. Military police involvement meant formal charges, which meant courts-martial proceedings, which meant their military careers were ending in the most humiliating way possible. Nakamura approached Colonel Williams and executed another perfect salute. "Ma'am, if I may," he requested formally. Corporal Thorne's current transfer orders assign her to a classified Joint Operations Unit. Her new position requires immediate processing to maintain operational security. Colonel Williams nodded grimly as she processed the implications. The harassment had delayed critical personnel movements that affected national security operations, adding federal implications to what was already a devastating disciplinary matter. Rodriguez was openly sobbing now as he comprehended that their morning entertainment had interfered with classified military operations. The woman they'd mocked and intimidated wasn't just a decorated veteran. She was essential personnel whose delayed processing could affect ongoing missions. "Corporal Thorne," Colonel Williams announced formally, "your transfer orders will receive immediate priority processing. Morrison, handle her paperwork personally and ensure all documentation is completed within the hour." Morrison nodded frantically, grateful for clear direction that would remove him from proximity to the disaster unfolding around the three privates. His hands shook as he gathered the necessary forms, knowing that he'd witnessed career-ending mistakes that would be discussed in military leadership circles for years. Kendricks made one final desperate attempt to minimize their situation. "Ma'am, we didn't know about her service record," he pleaded weakly. "If someone had told us who she was, we never would have said anything disrespectful." Colonel Williams' response was immediate and devastating. "The fact that you needed to know her service record before treating her with basic human dignity demonstrates exactly why you're unfit to wear the Marine Corps uniform," she declared with finality. Brennan stepped closer to Kendricks, his voice carrying the quiet menace of someone whose patience had been exhausted by ignorant excuses. "Every Marine deserves respect," he said with clinical precision. "The fact that you only show respect to people whose service records impress you proves you understand neither respect nor service." The sound of approaching military police vehicles could be heard through the building's windows, their sirens growing louder as they responded to what had become a priority incident involving assault of classified personnel. Volkov addressed all three privates simultaneously, his voice carrying the weight of someone whose own service had earned the right to judge their actions. "You spent this morning proving that wearing the uniform doesn't automatically make someone a Marine," he observed with devastating accuracy. Hassan was hyperventilating again as military police entered the administrative building, their presence transforming the scene from disciplinary meeting into formal arrest proceedings. The casual cruelty that had lasted 90 minutes would now result in consequences that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Colonel Williams turned toward Thorne one final time, her expression reflecting genuine admiration for someone whose grace under pressure exemplified everything the Marine Corps aspired to represent. "Corporal Thorne," she said formally, "thank you for your continued service to our nation." "Semper Fi, Marine." Thorne's response was immediate and proud, despite the morning's ordeal. "Semper Fi, ma'am," she replied with the dignity that had carried her through multiple combat deployments and would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead in her new assignment. 6 months later, the administrative building at Camp Pendleton had been transformed into something approaching a shrine to proper military conduct. A framed photograph of Corporal Elena Thorne receiving her Navy Cross from the President hung prominently near the personnel office, serving as a permanent reminder of the kind of Marine who deserved respect rather than harassment. Morrison had requested transfer to another base immediately after the incident, unable to face the daily reminder of how close he'd come to witnessing the destruction of a genuine American hero. His replacement, Staff Sergeant Shun, had been specifically briefed on treating every Marine with dignity regardless of their visible injuries or apparent assignments. The three military police officers who'd arrested Hassan, Rodriguez, and Kendricks had become reluctant celebrities among their peers, known for handling what became known as the Thorn Incident. Their arrest reports have been studied at military justice schools as examples of how quickly casual harassment could escalate into federal crimes. Nakamura, Brennan, and Volkov had received official commendations for their intervention, though all three insisted that protecting Thorn was simply basic human decency rather than extraordinary service. Their unit had adopted Corporal Thorn as an honorary member, and her photograph held a place of honor in their team room. Hassan had been sentenced to 6 months in military prison, followed by dishonorable discharge after a courts-martial that lasted 3 days. His testimony revealed the depth of ignorance that had driven his harassment, but his tears and apologies couldn't undo the damage to his military career. Rodriguez received similar punishment, though his complete emotional breakdown during arrest had earned him slightly more lenient treatment. He'd been assigned to mental health counseling to address the psychological damage caused by realizing he'd tormented someone whose courage exceeded anything he could comprehend. Kendricks had attempted to fight the charges, claiming his actions didn't constitute assault because he'd never actually struck Thorn. The military prosecutor had demolished his defense by playing security footage showing him deliberately intimidating a wounded veteran while she conducted official business. Colonel Williams had used the incident as a teaching moment throughout the Marine Corps, delivering presentations about respect, dignity, and the hidden heroes who served alongside every Marine. Her briefings had become mandatory viewing for all personnel arriving at Camp Pendleton. Thorn herself had excelled in her new classified assignment, her skills and experience proving invaluable in operations that would never be publicly acknowledged. Her commanding officers described her as the kind of Marine who made everyone around her better through example rather than criticism. The SEALs had maintained contact with Thorn through official channels, their respect for her service creating a professional relationship that transcended traditional Navy-Marine rivalries. Nakamura had written a letter to her new commanding officer explaining exactly why she deserved the highest levels of support and recognition. Staff Sergeant Shun had instituted new protocols in the administrative building, requiring all personnel to treat every service member with respect regardless of their apparent rank, assignment, or physical condition. Thorn's story had become part of the standard briefing for all new arrivals. The coffee station where Hassan, Rodriguez, and Kendricks had planned their harassment had been relocated to eliminate the casual gathering spot that had enabled their cruelty. The new arrangement forced personnel to interact more formally, reducing opportunities for the kind of pack mentality that had driven their behavior. Morrison's replacement had framed the key lesson from the Thorn incident above his desk, where every visitor could see it clearly. The sign read simply, "Every Marine has earned their place here. Treat them accordingly." Other administrative buildings throughout the Marine Corps had adopted similar measures after learning about the incident through official channels. Thorn's story had become a teaching tool about the heroes who served quietly among regular personnel without seeking recognition for their extraordinary sacrifice. The three privates' former peers had absorbed the lesson about judging people based on appearance rather than character. Several Marines had requested transfers after realizing they'd participated in similar harassment of personnel whose service records they'd never bothered to learn. Thorn's transfer orders had been completed within the hour, as Colonel Williams had promised, but her impact on Camp Pendleton had lasted far longer. Her dignity under pressure had demonstrated the kind of character that inspired others to examine their own behavior and find it wanting. If this story moved you, please drop a comment and let us know your favorite part, character, or if you've witnessed similar courage in real life. Sometimes the greatest heroes walk among us unrecognized, carrying scars that tell stories of sacrifice we can barely comprehend. The administrative building remained busy with the daily business of military personnel processing, but now every transaction was conducted with the awareness that appearances could deceive and every service member deserved respect until proven otherwise. Corporal Elena Thorne had transformed an entire military installation simply by maintaining her dignity, while others learned painful lessons about judgment, respect, and the true meaning of military service.